The hold-up robber originated among bad men of the gold mining camps. Unsuccessful as a prospector, too lazy to work, and with enough bravado and criminal instinct to commit desperate crimes. He first robbed prospectors and miners en route on foot to stage stations of their gold dust and nuggets, becoming bolder, looting stages, and eventually, after the railroads were built, he held up railway trains and robbed express cars. We can also find them from the daredevils of the Civil War, those from the Southwest who engaged in guerrilla warfare, where, as the pride of the states which sent them to the front, and because of their ambuscades, raids, and lawless acts during the war, they were received as heroes when they returned to their homes. The James Boys, the Youngers, the Renos, the Farringtons, the war giving them the reckless life they longed for, and experience fitting them for the life of crime they inaugurated immediately after.
William Pinkerton understood the Western outlaw better than most. Son of Allen Pinkerton, who created the famous Pinkerton National Detective Agency, William was also one of its top men. And he saw firsthand how the experiences of the guerrilla fighters in the Civil War prepared many for life as dangerous, deadly outlaws. The upheavals of the Civil War had aftershocks that lasted decades in the West as well as in the East. After the war, thousands of Americans rushed west to claim lands under the Homestead Act of 1862. This put settlers and Native American tribes at odds once again, at a time when the federal government had already been at war with many of the tribes for years. Meanwhile, the tribes in the Indian Territory, which is today the state of Oklahoma, had not been in direct conflict with the U.S. When the Civil War began, the federal government withdrew its troops from the western forts, leaving the tribes unprotected from their Confederate neighbors. Many felt that they had no choice but to ally themselves with the Confederacy. And when the war ended, the federal government declared them to have violated the terms of their previous treaty, and the new renegotiated treaty left the tribes with less land and a transcontinental railroad running straight through it. The end of the war also saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and similar militant white supremacist groups that used terrorist tactics to intimidate, beat down, and kill former slaves and the Republican agents of the Freedmen's Bureau who went south to enforce the changes of Reconstruction. But in the world of outlaws and lawmen, the Civil War played a major role in teaching a generation of future bandits how to rob, kill, mutilate, and terrorize their enemies. Fortunately, the war also imparted skills to those who would stand against the tide of chaos, and they would become the lawmen of the West.
The raid occurred on the morning of August 21st, 1863. It was a clear, warm, still morning. The guerrillas reached Lawrence just before sunrise after an all-night's ride from the border of Missouri. Myself and family were yet in bed and asleep. They passed directly by our house, and we were awakened by their yelling and shouting. I got up and went to the window to see what was the matter. And as I drew aside the curtain, the sight that met my eyes was one of terror. One that I shall never forget. The bushwhackers were just passing by my house. There were 350 of them, all mounted and heavily armed. grim and dirty from their night's ride over the dusty roads and were a reckless and bloodthirsty set of men. It was a sight we'd somewhat anticipated, felt that it might come, and one that we had dreaded ever since the commencement of the war. I turned to my wife and said, "The bushwhackers are here."
The Civil War in Kansas and Missouri was very different from the war in the East. Bands of armed men had been crossing the Missouri-Kansas border since long before the Civil War had begun. The pro-slavery bands were called border ruffians, and the free soilers were called jayhawks or redlegs. They were all bushwhackers. These rough men had only become rougher during the war.
No more terrifying object ever came down a street than a mounted guerrilla wild for blood. The bridle reins between his teeth or over the saddle horn, the horse running recklessly, the rider yelling like a Comanche, his long, unkempt hair flying wildly beyond the brim of his broad hat, the firing both to the right and left with deadly accuracy. When the town was filled with such men bent on death, terror ensued. Reason and judgment fled, and hell yawned.
On August 21st, 1863, a band of guerrilla raiders under the command of William Clark Quantrill tore through the town of Lawrence, Kansas. Long a supporter of abolitionists, Lawrence was attacked in retribution for a smaller assault by Union guerrillas in Osceola, Missouri. Approximately 200 people were killed during the Lawrence Massacre, most of them unarmed civilians. The bushwhackers, both Union and Confederate, killed without remorse, soldier and civilian alike. They each committed horrifying acts that only encouraged the other side to do even worse. Bushwhacker Jim Cummins gives a sense of this in his writing about his thoughts while deciding to join a guerrilla band.
In the year '63, I was at home in Clay County, Missouri with my mother. I had two brothers in the Southern Army who came to see my mother, and she was accused of harboring bushwhackers. Her neighbor boys who were in the Army would come to see her, and she would feed them, and she was accused of feeding bushwhackers. They accused my uncle, who had never taken any part in the war, of harboring bushwhackers, and took him from the threshing machine and shot him and then jumped their horses over him and left the prints of the horses' shoes on his body. Having looked the situation over, I determined to join the worst devil in the bunch. Frank James had joined Quantrill's band. While he was fierce, he was nothing compared with that terrible Bill Anderson. So I decided it was Anderson for me, as I wanted to see blood flow in revenge for the outrages the Jayhawkers had committed. You talk about Quantrill, Todd, and Taylor being reckless raiders and fighters, but Anderson I thought was worse than any of them when I joined him.
Bloody Bill Anderson certainly lived up to Cummins' description. But in addition to the indiscriminate slaughter of unarmed men, his tactics also included outright robbery, including stagecoaches and trains, and setting an example for outlaws to come. The first peacetime train robberies in the U.S. didn't occur until after the Civil War. But it was one more practice that outlaw gangs had learned during their time as guerrilla fighters. One instance of a train robbery by Bill Anderson's gang included the soon-to-be famous Jesse James, was also the scene of one of the worst massacres in the war. Anderson had led about 80 of his guerrillas into the town of Centralia, Missouri, on September 27, 1864. They were dressed in blue so that they might be mistaken for Union militia. This is from the history of Boone County, Missouri.
At last, Anderson gave the command to have the soldiers taken to the south side of the railroad and formed in line. The passengers were ordered to leave the train, and they huddled in groups about the grounds adjoining, clinging to each other and not daring to leave without permission. A few, seemingly stupefied or paralyzed with horror, remained in the cars, some of them crouching beneath the seats. "What are you going to do with them, fellas?" Arch Clements asked Anderson, alluding to the soldiers who stood trembling in line. "Parole them, of course," returned Anderson, with an ironical and sardonical emphasis on the word parole.
They pulled one Union soldier out of line, Sergeant Thomas Goodman. He was intended to be held to trade for one of their own who had been captured.
And now Arch Clements began to carry out Anderson's orders and to pour hell into the prisoners. Probably 25 men opened on the doomed line with revolvers at 20 paces. Expert pistol shots as they were, many of the guerrillas missed their aim. A dozen of the prisoners, shot through the brain or the heart, fell dead at the first volley. Others screamed and staggered about with a hand pressed to their wounds until, shot again and again, they tumbled lifeless to the ground. With cheers and shouts, the guerrillas now began to depart for camp. Every one of the guerrillas had plunder of some kind, and many of them had a good deal: greenbacks, gold watches, jewelry.
The Union soldiers dead and plunder gathered, Anderson and his guerrillas rode out, leaving the train depot burning. But even then, the day's slaughter wasn't over. Major Andrew Johnston and a battalion of the 39th Missouri Infantry arrived in town on a separate train that same afternoon. Upon seeing the devastation wrought by Anderson's guerrillas, Johnston set out with over 100 men hot on Anderson's trail. In fact, he had been hunting the guerrillas already. Unfortunately, Anderson knew that. In addition to the plunder, the strike on Centralia had been in large part a reconnaissance mission. If he found federal troops, he was to fight them. Before Johnston could catch up to Anderson, the guerrillas' chief scouts reached him with the news he had been waiting for. Anderson had joined up with another band of guerrillas, and now 400 lay in ambush. The Union troops were carrying muzzle-loading rifles. Deadly accurate at a distance, they were slow to reload. The guerrillas were all carrying multiple-shot revolvers. When the Union soldiers dismounted to prepare to fire, the guerrillas rushed in on horseback and slaughtered them.
In some respects, the Centralia fight has no parallel in the annals of the Civil War. It was the wildest and the most merciless, and in proportion to the number of the force vanquished, the most destructive of human life. Out of a total force of only about 90, which was in line of battle, and 30 others detailed to hold horses in the rear, 108 fell before the remorseless revolvers of Todd's and Anderson's men. Men who, fresh from the horrible scenes of blood and pillage and fire at Centralia that morning, were prepared for other scenes of carnage on a larger scale in the afternoon.
That carnage continued after the Union soldiers were dead. Sergeant Thomas Goodman, who eventually escaped, later reported.
Men's heads were severed from their lifeless bodies, exchanged as to bodies labeled with rough and obscure epitaphs and inscriptions, tied to their saddle bows, or sat grinning at each other from the tops of fence stakes and stumps around that scene. The fiends of hell itself could not exceed the spectacle and enormity of conception, or horror and brutality of execution.
Such were the teenage years of the boy who would become the most famous outlaw in America. Jesse and Frank James had grown up in a slave-owning home that strongly supported the Missouri border ruffians during the years before the war. Once the war started, that support only grew. First Frank, then Jesse a few years later, at age 16, joined up with Quantrill's Raiders. Soon they were both riding under Bloody Bill Anderson, along with Archie Clements, Cole and Jim Younger, Clell Miller, and most of the members of the group that would later be known as the James Younger Gang. Their mother, Zerelda Samuel, upon hearing that they had been involved in the Centralia massacre, responded that she was proud of her boys and that she asked God to protect them in their work. When the war was over, the James and Younger brothers took skills they'd learned as bushwhackers and applied them to banks and other targets. They may have joined Archie Clements, one of their old leaders, in the first daylight peacetime robbery in the U.S. The Liberty Tribune reported on the robbery of the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, February 13, 1866.
Our usually quiet city was startled last Tuesday by one of the most cold-blooded murders and heavy robberies on record. It appears that in the afternoon, some 10 or 12 persons rode into town, and 2 of them went into the Clay County Savings Bank and asked the clerk, William Bird, to change a $10 bill. And as he started to do so, they drew their revolvers on him and his father, Mr. Greenup Bird, the cashier, and made them stand quiet while they proceeded to rob the bank. After having obtained what they supposed was all, they put the clerk and cashier in the vault, and no doubt thought they had locked the door, and went out with their stolen treasure, mounted their horses, and were joined by the balance of their gang and commenced shooting. Mr. S.H. Holmes had 2 shots fired at him. Young George Wymore, aged about 19 years, was shot and killed while standing on the opposite side of the street.
Some have said Jesse James, at least, couldn't have participated in the robbery, as he was still healing from a serious chest wound. Regardless, he and Frank joined with Cole Younger and his brothers, Jim, John, and Bob, in a series of bank, stagecoach, and train robberies that would span decades. Jesse wasn't the leader of the gang. That may have been Archie Clements originally, and afterward Jesse and Frank shared that role with Cole Younger. But over time, Jesse became the gang's public face because Jesse himself loved the publicity. He wrote letters to governors, journalists, and lawmen, generally proclaiming his innocence in flowery prose that endeared him to many in a South still angry at their loss in the Civil War. His alliance with Kansas City Times editor John Newman Edwards helped in this. Edwards' editorials praising Jesse James and denouncing the federal government and the Republican Party helped make Jesse a hero. Jesse James was often presented then, and is often imagined today, as a sort of 19th century Robin Hood. But there is no evidence that James was giving his plunder to the poor. And as for robbing the rich, well, they were the ones with the money. History writer T.J. Stiles has made a convincing case that Jesse's outlaw career was truly an extension of his guerrilla activity under Anderson and Quantrill. His targets often had a connection to Union or Republican interests, or symbolized those interests to Jesse. That was certainly the case in the first robbery, in which Jesse James was clearly identified. although he was likely involved in various robberies undertaken by former members of Anderson's guerrillas, the first bank robbery and murder that could be pinned on Jesse was of a bank in Gallatin, Missouri in December 1869. The robbery in Gallatin was motivated by more than financial gain. During the robbery, Jesse murdered a cashier that he believed was the man responsible for killing Bloody Bill Anderson during the war. He was mistaken, and he drew the attention of the law. Then, in June 1871, he went a step further. He got the attention of the Pinkertons. Allan Pinkerton was a Scottish immigrant moving to the U.S. in 1842. He joined the abolitionist cause, providing his Illinois home as a stop on the Underground Railroad. In the 1850s, Pinkerton formed what would later become the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, or more commonly, the Pinkertons. During the war, Pinkerton served as the head of the Union Intelligence Service, the forerunner of the U.S. Secret Service. In February 1861, his agency identified a conspiracy to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln as he was traveling to be sworn in. Though today some question the true level of threat, at the time seen as real, and steps were taken to assure the president's safety. Throughout the war, Pinkerton agents worked as Union spies, going undercover to gather military intelligence. After the war, Pinkerton's agency focused on tracking down outlaws. In an age before the FBI, the Pinkertons were often hired by the U.S. government or express companies to track down and bring in bandits whose criminal activity spanned large areas. It wasn't long before the Pinkertons crossed paths with the James Younger Gang. Such was the flair of Jesse James. He liked to be noticed. He was noticed by the Pinkertons. Another of Allan Pinkerton's sons, Robert, joined a posse that chased the gang through the lower counties of Iowa. Local law didn't have authority once they crossed state lines, but the Pinkertons were not bound by jurisdiction. When the trail continued into Missouri, Robert Pinkerton followed alone. Robert's brother, William, later recounted,
Robert continued following the trail to the Missouri River, where the band separated, some crossing at Sibley Ferry, others at Blue Mill Ferry, all meeting afterwards at the Old Blue Mill, from which point they continued south, evidently making toward the James home in Clay County. Here, Robert Pinkerton, recognizing the folly of continuing alone, withdrew.
A member of the James Younger Gang would eventually be captured for the Corydon bank robbery. Clell Miller posted bail, however, and never went to trial. The Pinkertons and the James Younger Gang would clash again, repeatedly, over the next several years. The Pinkertons would hunt for the gang again after an 1874 train robbery. The Transcontinental Railroad opened up the West even further, and it meant the beginning of a new crime: train robbery. In 1907, Allan Pinkerton's son, William, described train robberies in the mid-19th century.
The average train robbery band formally consisted of from 5 to 8 men. Usually the hold-up man, to avoid identification and arrest, covers his face below the eyes with a triangular cloth or pocket handkerchief tied to the back of the head, wore a soft hat well down over his eyes, although in many of the great train and bank robberies shortly after the war, no masks of any kind were worn. Usually in these train robberies, one member of the band, with a red lantern or flag, at a lonely spot would signal the train to a standstill, or one or two would board the blind end of a baggage or express car nearing the point selected for the robbery, would climb over the tender into the locomotive, cover the engineer and fireman, while others of the bandits uncoupled the express or money car and forced the engineer to carry them a mile or two distant, where the cars and safes would be forced open with dynamite. Resistance usually resulted in the death of those who interfered. Escapes were usually made with horses in waiting, in charge of a Confederate at the place of the robbery, and often with relays of horses previously arranged, for covering 500 or 600 miles until they arrived at their homes or hiding places.
After a train robbery in 1874, the Adams Express Company hired the Pinkertons to investigate the James Younger gang. Pinkerton sent an agent to Liberty, Missouri, to gather information on the James brothers. That agent was captured and killed. Another was sent to St. Clair County, Missouri, tracking the Youngers. He was waylaid on the road, along with a former deputy sheriff who was guiding him. Both were killed, though one managed to shoot and kill John Younger in the gunfight. Pinkerton was rocked by the losses. The Adams Express Company determined not to pursue the case further, but for Pinkerton, this was no longer business. It was personal. Moving more cautiously now, he set up a base near the James's mother's home. Jesse and Frank frequently returned to visit their mother, Zerelda Samuel, who supported the gang by providing meals and intimidating witnesses. Pinkerton's plan was to firebomb Zerelda's house while Jesse and Frank, as well as the rest of the household, were inside. Unfortunately, Jesse and Frank had already left the home. The incendiary device that the men hired by Pinkerton hurled into the home exploded, killing not the outlaws, but their 8-year-old half-brother. Zerelda was seriously wounded, and part of her arm had to be amputated. Suddenly, the countryside was up in arms, screaming not for the capture of Jesse James, but in outrage at the Pinkertons. Allen Pinkerton never did catch Jesse James, which is considered one of his greatest failures. Jim Cummins, who rode with Jesse both during the war and after, later wrote in a book.
And how much did you make out of the job, and how much did the banks give you? You know, I don't know. But I believe that I can safely and truthfully say that the Pinkertons have spent over $500,000 of Secret Service money, and that of banks and railroads and express companies in this way. You cannot show today when any man belonging to the James or Younger gangs were ever caught through the Pinkerton agency.
But in the end, Jesse James would be shot in the back, killed by a man he trusted when he was just 34 years old. The Pinkertons provided critical assistance in investigations of major gangs like the James Youngers and the Renos. But most crime was handled by local law enforcement, marshals, and sheriffs. The Transcontinental Railroad meant sudden birth and incredible growth for new towns across the West, where local law enforcement would face serious difficulties. T.C. Henry, first mayor of the town of Abilene, Kansas, spoke of how the railroad connected the diverse parts of the nation and led to the creation of his own town.
Among the numerous trans-Missouri railroads projected was a line now known as the Union Pacific, which was built to and passed beyond Abilene in the spring of 1867, the first to penetrate Kansas. There were then practically no railroads west of the Mississippi, south of the Missouri, save for the Missouri Pacific. Not a single mile in all Texas. Isolated and remote from markets, that state from the first had made cattle raising its chief industry. Federal possession of the Mississippi during the war had shut in Texas, and an enormous cattle holding had accumulated there. One man, Joseph G. McCoy of Springfield, Illinois, conceived the idea of trailing those cattle to the nearest railway available, and thence, by shipment, placing them on the markets of the East.
At the time, Abilene was not an incorporated town, and as the mayor noted, for the first 2 years,
no effort was made to control the disorder and suppress the brazen lawlessness of the rough element gathered here.
Finally, in September 1869, the town was incorporated, and the following spring a government was in place. But boom towns could quickly get out of hand.
32 saloons were licensed, closing hours were enforced, and the more flagrant crimes punished. Gambling and minor vices were disregarded, for at best, barely more than a semblance of decency was hoped for. Such laws as were half tentatively ventured, of course, required executive enforcement. The office of town marshal was created. One after another was appointed and successively failed us. Conditions grew steadily worse. Disdain for the law and its officers increased. Growing cowboy insolence was exhibited in various ways. Finally, our failure to enforce order was contemptuously and concretely celebrated by the cowboy horsemen taking shots at the abortive firearms ordinance posters as they galloped by.
This is the beginning of the West, as it is remembered and imagined today. Riotous boom towns needing the firm hand of a lawman who could stand his ground. James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill, was already famous as a scout and as a gunfighter. He had fought for the Union during the war, serving as a scout for General George Armstrong Custer. Custer wrote of Hickok,
"Wild Bill was a strange character, just the one which a novelist might gloat over. He was a plainsman in every sense of the word, yet unlike any other of his class. In person, he was about 6'1" in height, broad shoulders, a well-formed chest and limbs, and a face strikingly handsome. His hair and complexion were those of the perfect blonde. The former was worn in uncut ringlets, falling carelessly over his powerfully formed shoulders. Add to this figure a costume blending the immaculate neatness of the dandy with the extravagant taste and style of the frontiersman, and you have Wild Bill, then as now the most famous scout on the plains. Whether on foot or horseback, he was one of the most perfect types of physical manhood I ever saw. Of his courage, there could be no question. It had been brought to the test on too many occasions to admit of a doubt. His skill in the use of the rifle and pistol was unerring, while his deportment was entirely free from all bluster and bravado. His influence among the frontiersmen was unbounded, his word was law, and many are the personal quarrels and disturbances which he has checked among his comrades by his simple announcement that this has gone far enough, if need be followed by the ominous warning that when persisted in or renewed by the quarreler, must settle it with me. Wild Bill is anything but a quarrelsome man, yet no one but himself can enumerate the many conflicts in which he has been engaged, and which have almost invariably resulted in the death of his adversary. I have a personal knowledge of at least half a dozen men whom he has at various times killed, one of these being at the time a member of my command. Wild Bill always carried 2 handsome ivory-handled revolvers of the large size. He was never seen without them.
James Butler Hickok was born in Homer, Illinois, in 1837. As a boy, he was involved in shooting competitions and was celebrated as a marksman with a pistol. Dreaming of adventure, when he was 18 years old, Hickok left Illinois for Kansas and took a job as a stagecoach driver, traveling the Santa Fe and Oregon trails. He was elected constable of Monticello Township, Kansas, in 1858. Hickok drew some attention in 1861 after his confrontation with a group he called the McCandless Gang. Accounts differ of what exactly happened, but it boiled down to Hickok being at a stagecoach and Pony Express station in Nebraska when David McCandless came in shouting about an overdue payment from the station company. McCandless and Hickok already had a history, with Hickok apparently stealing McCandless's mistress. But in this incident, McCandless was said to have made a threat against Hickok, who shot the man, killing him. Moments later, he shot two of McCandless's men. McCandless's 12-year-old son was present, but escaped, and later said that his father and the other men had been unarmed. Hickok, on the other hand, spun a tale of being outnumbered 9-1. In the end, Hickok was cleared of any wrongdoing, and his legend as a gunfighter had begun. During the Civil War, he had various jobs with the Union Army. He started as a teamster and then a wagon master, but in 1863 was hired by the provost marshal in Missouri as a detective, essentially a member of the military police. Later, he was a scout for General John Sanborn. Not long after the war, Hickok participated in one of a few known instances of a face-to-face, one-on-one, quick-draw duel. Wild Bill was a man who loved his guns, his women, and his cards. In more than one instance, he relied on the guns to get him out of trouble with women or cards. In July 1865, Hickok and another gambler, David Tutt, had a falling out over Hickok's alleged involvement with Tutt's sister and Tutt's alleged involvement with Wild Bill's girlfriend. That led to battles involving poker, as Tutt coached other gamblers and even loaned them money in an effort to break Hickok. Finally, Tutt swiped Wild Bill's gold watch, calling it collateral against a debt that Hickok disputed. Tensions rose until Tutt and Hickok were facing each other in the street, 75 yards apart. Both men reached for the gun and fired. Tutt's shot went wide, missing Hickok completely. Wild Bill's shot ripped through Tutt's chest, killing him. Hickok was arrested and tried for murder, but was found not guilty. The story of his duel was published in Harper's Magazine, making him famous. Over the next few years, Hickok worked as a scout for General George Custer during the Indian Wars, and as Deputy U.S. Marshal and then Sheriff in Hays City, Kansas. While in Hays City, he was involved in multiple gunfights, killing several men. When he followed Tom Smith as Marshal in Abilene, Hickok's gunfighter reputation and attitude meant a very different kind of marshal. His tenure in Abilene ended soon after an incident in which he accidentally shot and killed a deputy. Hickok was holding back a crowd during a street brawl when a local gunman, Phil Coe, fired 2 shots at him. Both missed, and Hickok drew and fired, hitting Coe, who would die a few days later. Seeing another movement off to his side, Hickok spun and fired again, killing his deputy, Mike Williams. Hickok was haunted by that act for the rest of his life. He was soon relieved of his duties as Marshal of Abilene. In 1873, Hickok briefly worked in an earlier version of Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, but his drinking and a vision problem were taking a toll on his legendary skills, and he didn't remain with the show for long. In 1876, Hickok was in Deadwood, South Dakota, gambling. Wild Bill always preferred to sit with his back to the wall, but on August 2nd, 1876, the only available seat had its back to the door. He asked twice to change seats with another man, but was refused. A buffalo hunter named Jack McCall, who had taken heavy losses gambling with Hickok a day earlier, entered the saloon. Without Hickok ever realizing, McCall drew a pistol, held it just behind Hickok's head, and pulled the trigger. Hickok died instantly. In his hand was a pair of aces and a pair of eights, forever after known as the dead man's hand. In that same year, the Civil War hero who had so admired Wild Bill would also meet his end. America's rapid expansion westward had caused repeated upheavals among Native American tribes. The tribes of the Southeast were moved to Indian territory above Texas in present-day Oklahoma. The Sioux leaders had been forced to cede most of the Minnesota territory in 1851. The influx of settlers resulted in fewer bison, elk, and other wild game. In August 1862, when the federal government was repeatedly late in its treaty payments, and his people were facing starvation, Chief Little Crow led the Sioux in an uprising in Minnesota. Over the next 5 weeks, the Sioux fought against settlers, militia, and the federal army. Hundreds of settlers and soldiers were killed, and over 100 Sioux. 1,500 Sioux were captured by U.S. Colonel Henry Sibley. Hundreds faced military trials, and 300 Sioux were sentenced to death for murder and rape. President Abraham Lincoln reviewed the individual case records, separating out those who had killed soldiers as part of their war with the U.S. from those who had killed or raped civilians. He commuted the sentence for all but 38 who were hung together on December 26, 1862, in what was still the largest mass execution in U.S. history. But other conflicts continued. Sioux wars in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. In 1868, the U.S. signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, guaranteeing that the Black Hills of South Dakota would be forever protected for the exclusive use by the Cheyenne and Sioux. But then in 1874, gold was found in the Black Hills. Miners rushed into Dakota lands. The federal government proved unable to keep prospectors and settlers out. Larger gold deposits were found in Deadwood Gulch, leading to the birth of the town where Wild Bill Hickok would be murdered in 1876, just months after the town was founded. Then, also in 1876, the Great Sioux War. Chiefs Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull were angered by the betrayal of their treaty rights and refused to surrender the land of their people. More than 10,000 Native Americans camped along the Little Bighorn River in the spring of 1876. On June 25th, Custer's 7th Cavalry found the camp. He led his 600 or 700 men forward. As word spread of the army's approach, Crazy Horse gathered thousands of Sioux warriors. Custer and his men were overwhelmed. Nearly 300 were killed, including Custer himself. 24 soldiers would be awarded the Medal of Honor for actions that day. Hickok and Custer were heroes of the West. Regardless of the accuracy of the stories told of Hickok's deeds, or of the decisions Custer made at the Battle of Little Bighorn, these men were already famous, and their deaths were felt in the East as well as the West. But their deaths also highlighted the dangers that still existed in the wild lands that the federal government was trying to tame. Dangers that would be faced by the lawmen of the West.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.